Mr. Chairman, my substitute authorizes the use of force only if Iraq fails to promptly agree to an effective and robust weapons inspection and disarmament program, or it also authorizes force if Iraq in any way interferes with that program. The substitute also defines an effective inspection and disarmament program as requiring an immediate, unobstructed, unannounced entry into all facilities, including absolutely everything without exception, and of course no exceptions for so-called presidential palaces. Finally, the amendment directs the President to seek a UN resolution in support of these robust inspection and disarmament approaches. But it does not condition the President's authority to use force on that UN action. And that is because I believe that Saddam's nuclear weapons program poses a national security threat to the United States, which we should not ignore, even if we are unable to win support from France or from Russia or from China. So this amendment in the nature of a substitute authorizes force as Plan B and authorizes and directs as the first approach a demand, unequivocal, for an inspection program that is complete, thorough, and unimpaired in any way.
But I would like to move to a vote on this.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
I hear three Mr. Chairmans. Is that
Mr. Paul?
Mr. Paul? Mr. Paul, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to speak in favor of the amendment. It's not the type of amendment that I would have drawn up. It does recognize the authority of the United Nations, and I do not believe our national security interests and our national sovereignty should depend on the United Nations, but nevertheless, this amendment is a big improvement over the current resolution, so I will support this amendment. But I think it's important to note that the process that we're dealing with is very important. As I mentioned yesterday, we should not forget that the overall philosophy of our foreign policy brings us to events like this because our philosophy and our foreign policy for 50 years has been designed not to declare war, but to slip into war, get sanction of war by the United Nations, and also to give our presidents more power and authority than the Constitution gives them. So I want to remind my colleagues of that, as well as of the shortcomings of this war, because it really isn't a war in national defense. We have not been attacked. So I think we should continue to remember that, and that we deal with the process, we deal with the philosophy, and we deal with the wisdom or lack of wisdom for the war. This resolution moves in the direction of restraint, making use of the United Nations in a reasonable fashion under today's circumstances, which I think is much better than getting and pressuring the United Nations to rubber stamp our efforts to go to war in the name of peace. Because, of course, you don't go to the United Nations to declare war. There's no provision for that. The United Nations only can pursue peace. And that's why when you go to war under the United Nations banner, it's not called war. They don't declare war. They call this a police action or a mission for peace. And I think this is misuse of words and terminology, and we should hone in on what we're doing here. We're talking about war. We're talking about going to war, and I support this resolution because I think it will make us stop and think a little more carefully without the total rejection of the international order that exists that I would like to someday challenge, and I continue to challenge, but we should continue to watch this. And would you...
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I would yield.
Yeah, I want to take the opportunity to respond to the gentleman from Nebraska who referenced in his distinguishing between Saddam Hussein and North Korea and Iran in terms of propensity to or in the case of Iraq, having demonstrated the willingness to use weapons of mass destruction. Well, I think to set the record straight, it was the Gulf War occurred in 1990. It's been reported in a variety of venues that the message was sent clearly and unequivocally by Secretary Baker, and I believe now Secretary of State Powell, that if there was the utilization of chemical or biological warfare, there would be a devastating response by the United States. And the reality is, he did not use weapons of mass destruction during the course of the Gulf War. Unless I'm incorrect, there have been only 2 occasions when Saddam Hussein utilized weapons of mass destruction. One was in 1988 against the Kurds in northern Iraq.
May I quickly retrieve my time, because the time is running out. Later, when I have more time, I would like to admit some evidence to the committee that really challenges even that assumption about what happened with the Kurds, and it comes from a Pentagon report. So I would like to follow up on that later, but if you can go ahead and finish.
And I would just conclude by saying that the United States, at that point in time, was fully aware of his use of weapons of mass destruction, and we didn't hear a peep out of the then administration in terms of condemning that horrific act. And the reality is also that we were fully aware that during the course of the war against Iran by Iraq, that there was the utilization of weapons of mass destruction.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Against the Iranian army.
Mr. Menendez, gentleman's time has expired. The question occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested, and the clerk will call the roll.